Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Our final session for the day and for the 14th edition of March meeting is titled New Forms of Extraction and Surveillance. It's a pleasure to welcome our panelists, artist Lawrence Hamdan, camp artist Shaina Anand, and Ashok Sukumaran, who's joining us via Zoom. Fouad Makki, Associate Professor, Department of Global Development and Director, Polson Institute for Global Development at Cornell University, who also joins us via Zoom. And Nidhi Mahajan, Art Assistant Professor, Anthropology, University of California, Santa Cruz, and Inaugural Fatema Mernissi Postdoctoral Fellow, Social and Cultural Studies, the Africa Institute. The panel is moderated by Surafel Wondimu Abebe, Assistant Professor, Performance Studies and Theory, the Africa Institute, Sharjah. I would now like to hand over to the panelists.
Because we all look energetic, we don't feel tired. I'll take my time to speak for long. Without further ado, I would like to invite first Lawrence to give us, his presentation after his exhibition, his amazing performance yesterday. I think it is another addition today to have Lawrence's presentation, please.
Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk today. I've prepared a short presentation that is a set of my personal kind of artistic responses to surveillance. That was the kind of remit of the discussion. And I will speak about a work from 2016 and then the most recent work that's actually in Gallery 4 now, and which I was part of the same research of the performance from last night. I mean, a lot of what I do has concern with surveillance, but surveillance as a kind of noise, actually. I don't think surveillance is a kind of intake. I think it's also a production of noise, and I hope that will come clear as we move through these two projects. Both these projects are kind of, they don't share a kind of aesthetic sensibility, but they sort of, there's a common desire among them to sort of watch the watchers, if you like. And so without further ado, I will start. Before we all carried around personal microphones, wiretapping had to be a lot more creative. For the CIA or FBI, bugging a room largely involved hiding microphones in lamps, light fixtures, concealed in wall orifices, plug sockets, and switches, suspending microphones into rooms using the wiring and piping cavities. These were all excellent technique at concealing microphones, but the recordings were horrible, with one word in every 20 escaping the fog of infrastructural sound. Half-completed sentences buried in the sound of water distributing to toilets, while other key information is swallowed in thick electrical interference. The sounds of the home we have become so intuitively accustomed to tuning out with our naked ears were being unsurpassably magnetized to the tape's surface. The background had come to overwhelm the foreground, necessitating new techniques and technologies to return the background to its rightful place. The incessant buzz of electrical interference was one of the easier artifacts to peel away. A loud hum of 50 hertz in Europe or 60 hertz in the US could be theoretically filtered out with ease. So hypothesized Dr. Katalin Grigoris, a forensic audio expert hired to enhance wiretapped recordings. In 1991, Grigoris was working to enhance the audio quality of analog tape recordings for legal use. His initial attempts to filter these sounds out by applying a 50 hertz filter, the frequency at which the electricity buzzed, were unsuccessful. Small electrical noises still penetrated the recordings randomly between 49 and 51 hertz. In February 2014, I had a telephone interview with Grigoris in which he explained, "This is first of all how I found out the ENF, electrical network frequency, is not 50 hertz. It's just something random around 50 hertz. I built in the lab an adaptive noise filter that is able to follow and detect the real sound of this buzz and subtract it. The idea then is that ENF is something not random, was something random, not predictable, was clear in my mind then. So the adaptive noise filter that Grigoris built to clean this oscillating electrical noise off a recording was also by necessity mapping the random fluctuations of this buzz. In the days of analog recordings, this song of electricity was meaningless noise, as the technical moving parts of the tape recorder moved at fluctuating, unsmooth speed. So that meant each machine added to that oscillating electrical noise its own small variations in pitch. However, given that digital recording relies not on mechanical circuits, but rather encodes audio into a sequence of symbols, the pattern of oscillation of the electricity buzz was captured without any extra speed fluctuations and distortions added by each analog machine. Therefore, any two digital recorders, regardless of their brand, size, and voltage, would record the buzz in almost exactly the same way. So two digital recordings made at the same time but at two different locations on the same electricity grid would both have the exact same random pattern of oscillation of electricity. Grigoris theoretically derived that because the pattern of fluctuation is so random and the probability of that same pattern repeating over a 10-second piece of audio was so unlikely, then by listening to the buzz of digital audio, it should be possible to deduce exactly when that recording was made. The recording was full of hum, noise. I first of all how to extract it and then realized it's not predictable. Unique variations can be used as an indication or authentication of time, but we needed a database. No electrical company was able to record with high enough quality the sound of that buzz. So I said, okay, let's build my own database. And that's how I started in '96. Grigoris developed a system for the better eradication of unwanted noise. And while getting to know that noise closely in order to eradicate it, he understood that it was not at all noise, but a song of sorts. The melody of this buzz did not follow the logic of a musical motif. Its rather strange song almost never repeats itself. But this total unpredictability, each 5-second phrase unique to the next, paradoxically made it easier to decipher as a unique timestamp. Grigoris' theory was that electricity buzz could work as a kind of digital clock, was actualized, and it became an active participant in legal investigations. He recounts his early experiments as such. The very first big tests that I made were in '97. I started step by step. I made 2 simultaneous recordings in the same office, and then in the same building, and then in the same city, and then I went as far as to different cities in Romania where he was based, and then I crossed onto that same grid out of Romania onto a European scale. Grigoris realized during the course of these tests in Romania that the European Union, with the exception of the United Kingdom, plus parts of the Ukraine, I think I wrote that pre-Brexit, it's not the European Union anymore, plus parts of Ukraine are interconnected by one vast electricity grid. The oscillations in the frequency of the mains buzz are a result of the electrical's grid function to avoid power surges, and therefore to regulate the distribution of electrical current. Therefore, the electricity grid stabilizes the distribution of electricity across the continent, which in acoustic terms means that it maintains the same buzz across the grid. This meant that from Grigoris' lab in Romania, he was able to create a database and archive mains hum, which allowed him to analyze recordings and ascertain exactly when they were made for cases he then worked on in countries beyond Romania's borders, such as Germany, France, Spain, Cyprus, and Denmark, over the next 20 years. His database began 10 years before the European Union formally included Romania in its jurisdiction. Preceding the 2007 inclusion of Romania into the EU, the continental electricity grid nonetheless synchronized independent legal authorities into a single pattern of oscillation, which through Grigoris' work came to be legally recognized as a register of time for any recording in a place across continent. In Grigoris' lab, time and continental space are flattened into an unpredictable yet linear pattern of sonic oscillation between 49 and 51 hertz. For legal reasons, Grigoris could not share with me details of the cases he has worked on, though he did summarize a few of the circumstances where his analysis has been most effective. Firstly, the timestamp of mains buzz can be used as a way for someone to prove where they were at a specific time. The recording of the buzz can work like an alibi, so that if the police accuse them of being present at a crime, and they have a recording themselves somewhere else with a conflicting timestamp, a conflicting mains buzz, to the event in question, then ENF analysis can be effective in proving the exact time of that recording, thus proving they were not present when the crime happened. Secondly, proving that someone has prior knowledge of a crime is often important in legal disputes or in contestation of corruption cases. Here, ENF analysis could be used to prove somebody knew something before they claim they did, right? For example, there's a recording of someone speaking about illicit activity, and then they would be guilty if it can be proved that this recording was taken before a certain date and time. Finally, to come to the most commonplace use of this analysis, if someone is caught on a recording that is being used as evidence against them, but they know the recording has been edited to make it sound as if they said things they didn't say, or that contextual material had been edited out to change the sense of their statements. In this case, the timestamp of the mains buzz at different moments in the recording would prove that it is indeed edited by showing that the mains buzz is composed of a patchwork of different times pieced together. The last example was crucial in the conviction of 3 men for illicit arms dealing in 2012 case in the UK, where ENF analysis allowed prosecutors to show that a wiretapped voice recording, which became vital to their case, was unedited and therefore authentic. Defense lawyers of the subsequently convicted arms dealers had suggested that the recording could have been edited by the police to incriminate the accused. However, ENF showed that the pattern of the mains buzz oscillation throughout the entirety of the audio matched the buzz from their database that correlated to the same time the recording was made, proving that there were no interventions and the buzz was continuous with a national archived pattern of oscillation across the country. This trial, as well as leading to the conviction of the arms dealers, revealed for the first time that ENF analysis was actually being used not only in Grigoris's lab in Romania, but also by the British police force independently as a surveillance system. So this is a previously undisclosed fact, as the UK has its own national grid. It's not conjoined with the European continental grid. So the buzz is different. So this piece of information communicated for the first time that whether emitted from a neon light in Glasgow, a fridge in Southampton, or a laptop in London, the police were recording and, if necessary, listening to the nation's buzz. And that kind of inspired me. In many ways, I find it very inspiring that this guy spent his life's work listening to noise. Kind of what I've been doing also, but not so specific, like just that one buzz. But anyway, so I thought it was really important that, there was all this surveillance work. It was revealed that the police were recording these buzz, but it was a kind of national buzz. It was a buzz that belonged to the people. So I decided to start a project where I would try to at least give the buzz back. So this is the hummingbirdclock.info. This is the oscillating pattern of mains buzz as recorded in an office of the Liverpool Biennial. It's good to see they haven't disconnected it still after these years. And it was this idea that if we should be starting these archives of mains buzz outside of only the auspices of police, and actually have this as something where you could use the mains buzz as a verifiable thing for anyone to use. So this is the website. You have a clock, of course, it's a time. Time in the UK is 2:16. And here you have basically the possibility to submit a claim and send a recording for analysis and authentication. Okay. Where's this? Okay, it's also a permanent kind of public sculpture installation. It's a series of binoculars that sit in just outside the law courts in Liverpool. And when you look through the binoculars, you see the town clock. And the whole thing buzzes and informs you of the possibility to submit the website. To be perfectly honest, I haven't had many submissions, and I now get a lot of spam. But I did have one case where it would have been really necessary, but unfortunately, the recording was from 2015, and we started the database in 2016. But it's really about instituting something that you don't know where it could go. At some point, it might become alive again, might become adapted. So now we'll talk about this work. Air conditioning, which is just opened 2 days ago. This is them literally pulling off the plastic from Gallery 4. Air conditioning is a work that I was trying to find a sort of language for all of these routine invasions of Lebanese sky by the Israeli Air Force, unmanned aerial vehicles, fighter jets, and drones. And this, of course, the main sort of reason, outline for these continual sort of noises in the sky, thank you, is under the idea that it's for surveillance, but of course it might be surveillance, it probably is. It's also threatening, it's also training, it's also a lot of things. So it sort of exceeds simply surveillance as a kind of category. And also as an experience. It's not just a feeling of being surveyed as such. But it was really in the summer of the lockdown where this really started to get really loud, because of course air traffic was down in general, except the skies were louder. So I had everyone all over the world telling me, "Wow, it's so nice, the skies are clear." And in Beirut and Lebanon, and especially the south, the skies were not clear at all. So it struck me then to start looking back, and of course it's been going on since 1949. Actually, you can find the first mock raid that happened in 1949, but there's been consistently collected data by the UN since the governments signed the truce after the Israeli invasion in 2006. So that meant that the UN were to police and give radar information about all of these planes independently as a kind of peace negotiation. And these documents are really disparately sort of placed around the UN's digital library. Most of them can be found fairly easily. Some of them, as Nabla Yahya will tell you, not so easily, but she found them because she's amazing. And so we gathered all these documents. They're PDFs. We made a database, and we started to think about what to do with this information. And it was really a pattern. It was really a goal to make a kind of a cumulative sort of image for this thing, because all of these moments are defined by their ephemeral or passing or individualized sort of condition. So let's say you're boiling a kettle, you didn't hear the F-35, but someone next to you or in the next room heard it, and maybe they tell you, did you hear that? No, I didn't hear it. So it's kind of atomized, right, like the experience. And I found it important to sort of make a singular kind of, take all these moments from the last 15 years and to make one kind of singular experience out of it. And the way I decided to sort of make this pollutant, which is sound pollution, visible, is by rendering them as clouds. And there was a kind of way in which we were to use Houdini. So the people who did the visualization are called Cream Projects. They were here. They just left. And they are sort of really good with Houdini, or at least way better than me. And they came up with a system, which I'll show you now, to sort of render these clouds and these pollutants in different ways. So I'll just kind of play you this video that sort of talks us through the thing. So almost 22,000 Israeli military aircraft have come in the last 15 years. And so each cloudscape is 365 centimeters. So every centimeter is 1 day in the installation. It's 54 meters. And this is 2020. These are little mini drones, as you see here. These unmanned aerial vehicles sound like that. And these are fighter jets that sound like that. They're defined by the altitude at which they fly, but also the kind of texture of the cloud is dependent on this, is a kind of illustration of the sonic experience of each one of these different vehicles. Now, the shape of the cloud, so that's all the unmanned aerial vehicles in 2020. Here you see the kind of shape of the cloud is actually made originally from a kind of bar chart, which defined the height by the amount of planes that came during that month. As you see here, in August there was 405 UAVs. And the depth of the cloud, the plume, the kind of thickness of the plume, is defined by the amount of time these aircraft spent circling the atmosphere. And so you see here, actually, in one occasion, UAVs have been circling for 32 hours on the 14th of September. So that's how this kind of the machine then renders, and Houdini is specifically made for rendering clouds, smoke, fire, particulates. And it usually does these kind of background images. And again, just like the buzz, it's about bringing things that are meant to be in the background, violences that are in the atmosphere or behind us, or, both these works are really about the background, about sort of thinking seriously about background sound. And so bringing these kind of atmospheres from video games and everything and actually making them the sort of central focus was important. So you see, this would be a high traffic of unmanned aerial vehicles. Again, high traffic of fighter jets in January 2020. There are sort of ellipses or emissions in the piece that refer to the fact that we couldn't recover that month's data in the UN's digital library. We could just not find it. Whether it might be there somewhere, but we've spent a long time looking for it. It's not there. And this is the highest recorded event, I think. In a single day, 51 flights came, on the 26th of July, 2020. And that's how these kind of textures are rendered. And in the end, we end with a blank spot. So that's that piece. As I said, it sort of connects to the other one as well. And the end. Thank you. You left it on the mirroring? Okay, thank you.
Next is going to be Shaina, and next to her, Ashok from Camp group.
Hi, everybody. And hi, Ashok. We wish you were here in person and not via a post-pandemic medium that spread faster than the virus, and that's going to stay with us, extracting data and labor long after this pandemic is over. I had my performing time at the opening of our show, P through P, Passages Through Passages, at Bet Al Serkal in the Museum Square, curated by Hural Kasimi and carefully put together by the Sharjah Art Foundation team. I do hope you can see firsthand how camp engages over time with mediums like data leaks, privacy publics, video surveillance documentary, internet autonomy, also ships, seas, roads, electricity, neighbors. What underscores our practice and why we collaborate with and create small worlds inside these networks in the way we do. So since I had my say, I'm going to pass the baton on to Al-Rafiq, my comrade, who came Qabla al-Tariq before we began this journey. Ashok. We're going to offer you 2 observations and 2 examples.
Hi, Shaina.
I think the sun is set in Bombay. You might need some light.
That's the thing. There are some clouds in the air. Yeah, thank you all. It's lovely to be here. I wanted to suggest and think a little bit about the kind of promise that's implied in the distance between the subject that's sort of new and obviously widespread global surveillance and extraction, and us, and what an artistic approach involves, and Lawrence has just shown an example of that, right? But I think that classically, like, or in some sort of traditional sense, that there's an idea that thought or art are scale-free, right? And I want to hold on to that idea a little bit, and to say that, like, a painting could represent a war, or could embody it in some way, or a song could embody a group of people or a generation, right? Or a shot in Manikol's beautiful film called Agaman about Bombay could anticipate a vertical city that's not yet there, but it's coming, right? So I want to anticipate this, or I want to think about this sort of magical possibility in art and in thought of addressing something of the scale and complexity of global surveillance, not only as a, let's say, a visualization of it, or not only as a way of as another representation of it, but by some other sets of processes, by some artistic magic, right? That's the promise. That's the only way we can sort of actually respond to it, I think. Now, a critic would say that, or let's say post-contemporary critic, somebody like Suhail Malik would say that this is precisely the promise that allows for the exploitation, or, you know, of art, right? This sort of infinity of art, it's sort of its ability to transcend its material constraints is precisely the problem, and we should look at it in other ways, right? We cannot have this carrot always that art will provide this, and we cannot. This is not the carrot that art workers and artists around the world can be motivated by alone, right? We have to have a different kind of analysis of culture, and I agree with that as well, right? But because from the artist side, I think that this problem is very common, right? This is what I'm sort of getting at, that there's a vast sort of world of things and contexts, and the discrepancy, the distance between the framing of a problem and what you make and do is always vast, and everywhere. I remember once being invited to the city of Hamburg around the year we were in Documenta, and, you know, it's also told as a trajectory where the city of Hamburg was a great merchant city. It has the greatest number of millionaires in the world, and therefore we have all these evolved and highly sophisticated institutions, and we want to commission a public art project, blah blah blah, and your budget is €1,000, and, you know, so which is, of course, a pretty decent budget for art world, right? But this constant discrepancy in scale, and do we rely on a magical art to cross that, right? Or do we think about it in other ways, right? And this, of course, is similar in Mumbai and where we live, and in where you are, and in Karachi, and so on, right? So how do we frame it in a way that sort of avoids this framing on both ends, either as a sort of vast economic and power discrepancy, or as magical art, right? So at Camp we've been struggling with the problem that our forms of engagement, our forms of expression are very, very unstable, right? There is no given that if you produce a photograph, an image, an analysis, that there is an institution that will host it, right? So it's been for 15 years a form of self-institution, like producing the ground, let's say, for what this kind of work might be, and where and how to sort of fight our fight, right? Um, and I think, like many others, we're trying to take in our specific ways some of the energy and the forces around us of these much larger, much more sophisticated structures, and to try to jujitsu them into an artistic program, right? Which also you could say is a kind of parasite mode of operation. And this parasite is, of course, greatly honored if it's parasited in turn, right? That's its promise or its quality. Now, this systemic context is obviously very, very different from, let's say, the classic avant-garde and many other art historical contexts, right? And where the sort of the background of the state support is completely missing, and is also not something we seek. And so some examples on that will follow. The second is a sort of note about observations on the nature of technology, some specific examples, and the politics around it, which is, of course, a fundamental force in what we are talking about in the nature of surveillance and extraction. So here's one example that in the past 20 odd years that we've been around in this discussion, there was a belief in a regional intellectual tradition, right? That the complexity and the layering and the informality of everyday life in places like South Asia would escape most of these technologies, right? They would ultimately be unable to be subsumed by technical systems, that there will always be an overflow and excess and so on and so on. And I'm trying to sort of point to something specific in a very broad discussion, but I remember 15 years ago, lots of discussions around the Aadhaar, that's the National Biometric ID program, and a lot of subaltern intellectuals and related urbanists and so on saying, no, this is no way that can happen. People are going to rate the name of their dog, and and there was evidence to say that this was a very leaky, very porous, very noisy, system that would collapse under its own weight. We're talking about 1 billion plus people and so on and so on. But and there were examples of this, right? That there was people with, there were multiple Aadhaar cards made in the name of Amitabh Bachchan and Mahatma Gandhi and so on. And there were videos of people from Nepal and Bangladesh paying, 200 rupees to get their Aadhaar cards. And so, completely porous madness around this thing, and also, but a desire in some places to be counted, and amongst other places, a desire to be refused. But my point is that, like 15 years later, we have a 99% sort of percolation of prevalence of Aadhaar biometric ID in the population, right? It's a massively successful, at some level, public-private partnership, and it has huge consequences for what will happen in the future. And so a lot of this noise around, got moved elsewhere in the network, right? So a lot of the corruptions, a lot of the implementation details, they got moved elsewhere, and we do have a national ID backbone, right? Which is actually pretty functional and pretty operational and very, very troubling, right? It has incredible consequences. So just to say that there is a platform question here, right? There is not only the question of where the, let's say, the glitch is, or where the noises move to, and where we can intervene, but there's also, in the background of this, there are these massive platforms that are actually somehow, despite all this, being made. And the final example, before we come to the actual examples, is this question of where do we where in the network of contemporary extractive processes do we enter, right? So because it is not, as we all have experienced, these are not local phenomena. But I wanted to show you an example of how this pans out in the case of someone walking a landscape, a friend of ours who was also a Padma fellow, walking between 39 power plants that have been newly installed in 2 districts in Chhattisgarh in central India, and looking for an image, like looking for a break, looking for some sort of some series of places where you could understand what this is doing, right? And where are they, right? So when you're staring at a power plant, right, this is the sort of question, right? What is a power plant, and where would we find an image of it? So I wanted to share maybe just very quickly my screen, and then I'll pass to Shaina for part 2. Okay, so this is Sunil walking, on foot. A guy who has worked in Manrega, sort of analysis, loves Iranian cinema, bought his first camera, traveled extensively, and then applied for a film project to try and follow this phenomenon of power plants popping up in every second village. You can literally see one from the other one. And here, I think that he writes very beautifully about this as a problem. Sorry, it's in Hindi, but there's a form of writing that at Padma we were exploring, where there's a text that is extensively connected to video clips. Sorry, I might have to refresh that, but where he's offering a kind of a early skeleton of what his treatment might be, right? And here he's struggling along with us to answer the question of where and in what way he could describe a very distributed phenomenon of coal coming from 100 kilometers away, water being locally available, which is the reason why these plants exist, and the connection to the national grid, right? So there's a lot of sort of research and analysis in sort of sociological terms around this, but he's looking for the image, right? And one of the places, I mean, there are a few places where he finds images that are relevant, but one of the places that I thought was compelling was places like this, where you can see one of the places in this network of massive power production, where the waste of that process is suddenly visible, right? And this is several kilometers away, and the whole area is filled with ash dikes, and that's sort of the crazy alien landscape where you finally sort of realize that this is coal waste, right? And it's being pumped out onto the land. So just to sort of wrap that up before, so this quest for the image of, this quest for where the alterity, where the where the thing that actually can touch you or move you or provide you an insight, right? This is not easy in relation to contemporary phenomena which are so distributed. And so what we are explaining in the next couple of examples is a strategy or a way of looking for that image. Shaina, do you want to take over? Hello?
Hello. Ashok, we've
Hello.
been told we have 5 minutes left.
Hello?
So I'll try to hurry it up, but you need to turn your light on because you look like a hostage.
Oh.
It's a hostage video at the moment, which Lawrence says it kind of is.
Yeah.
So
All right.
I just want to take on example 2, and I'll try to be quick. But in 2007, right after we formed Camp, we, along with colleagues in Bangalore, Berlin, and Bombay, made Padma, short for Public Access Digital Media Archive, or https://pud.ma. It was a footage archive of the contemporary whose content and custodianship was to come from the independent video practitioners. This was a specific proposal and a formal application to care for the 99 hours of footage, say, that were left out of a finished film, to align its log notes, transcripts, and allied research material and texts to its time base, and then to open it up to further writing and non-commercial and pedagogic and artistic use. Now, we could do this in 2007 because none of us were on Facebook or any time after that. And for us, another kind of internet was possible. I want to bring in thesis number 1 of the 10 theses of the archive that Padma's Rafiqs wrote in Beirut in 2010 that evolved from this practice, right? It said, don't wait for the archive or to be archived. And maybe thesis number 5 is of relevance here, which says the archive deals not only with the remnant, but also with its reserve. And capitalist production proceeds by isolating the extract from the raw materials, producing the remnant, that which is left behind. And the archive, resisting this obsolescence, is constituted through these remnants. This is one common view. But there is another place in the contemporary where the role and responsibility of the archive may lie, that is, in addressing the reserve, that which is not yet deployed. The archive, in this sense, is sympathetic to those practices which sabotage capitalistic accumulation and those which have an interest in the future and the unrealized. So Padma's own paradigm of making this archive of that which supposedly was left behind, which in the economy of contemporary image making was 99 hours or 99% of what you would use. Padma's own paradigm was inverted in 2013 when, in the centenary year of Indian cinema, we created https://indiancine.ma, which contained both film and scholarship around bodies of cinema in over 25 languages. And so a vast and complex heritage of commercial cinema was now situated not within its original capitalistic model or YouTube, but as a knowledge commons that over the years and counting has more material than our National Film Archive. So a few people with computers could do this with the technique, rigor, and infrastructure that we had practiced and nurtured. And just to close that bit very quickly, 3 weeks ago, the Films Division, or the fascist government announced that Films Division, our state commissioning newsreel and documentary, the state commissioning agency, was going to be shut down and was going to be merged with the National Films Development Corporation of India, which is already a public-private partnership. So here again, an archive might be A, completely censored, or most likely monetized, right? So Padma already has 756 films from the Films Division, and these were actually, most of which came into the archive because Camp itself was doing a deep history of housing in Bombay, right? So most of the films here are coming because of our research, right? And they go back into the archive. So we've got to be very nimble, we've got to be very precise and find ways to put in 8,000 other Films Division material so that they will be preserved and protected by setting them free in the commons. So I'll just go over to Ashok. Please give him 2 minutes more, and then we can end our talk.
Okay, sorry if we've gone over. So I think, as Shaina was saying, that the desire, the parasitic desire to turn all these reserves into new sets of images can be seen in a lot of our current work, including a series on housing. I wanted to end by reminding ourselves of a particular context that we were part of in the UAE, and it's a kind of example of let's say, regional politics and regional art struggles. Um, we in 2009, 2008, 2009, the Guggenheim announced that in New York announced that they were going to build a very large Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. And I remember in 2011, we were invited to the Guggenheim in New York, and they had a table-sized, like dining table-sized model of the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. And the existing Guggenheim in New York, a picture of which is down there in the middle, was the size of a teacup or a saucer, let's say, right? So this was a gigantic intervention into a planned intervention into a regional artistic context, right? It's designed by Frank Gehry and involved 20 to 40,000 estimated construction workers on Saadiyat Island. Now, in 2009, 10, there began to be reports, a lot of them international, but also local press that said that conditions on the island were not good for people doing this building project, including the Louvre, which, as you all know, has opened, that people did not have access to their passports, that they were in debt, which is a very common situation for construction workers coming here. They've paid for their job, and so they cannot leave. They don't have mediation or bargaining methods, and so on. So the dissonance between a very large-scale regional institution and their cultural claims and its community art program and so on, which we were invited to, and its actual building project was extreme, right? So in 2011, there was this letter, which is here, and I'll end in a minute or two, which was signed by a large number of our contemporaries, which basically said that there were about 100 people to start with, and this grew to 3,000, who basically said that they would not be collected by or engaged with the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi until these problems with the proposed project were resolved. And I really encourage everyone to revisit this, because there is a new context in which all this is becoming useful. And it was a very serious sort of group engagement by a large group of people. It involved organizations in India, like the New Socialist Initiative and labor organizations. And we all conducted a lot of, I would say, pretty serious, sensible analysis of the situation. And we had 4 years of negotiations with the Guggenheim, which eventually sort of broke down. And then, of course, the project itself sort of collapsed, right? And we were dealing specifically with problems like Zaha Hadid saying, we make drawings, not buildings. And, the scene in Sidney Pollack's film, I think, where Frank Gehry throws a piece of paper on the table, and that's what led to the shape of the Guggenheim, right? So we're talking about these problems like this network handoff, right? Where people said that we are not responsible for this, and those people are not responsible for that, and so on. So this is not about picking on something that is not present in India or in other parts of the world, but it's really an opportunity to do something with the $850 million budget that you had, and out of which we proposed a $10 million workers' welfare fee, and so on and so on. So we thought these were pretty basic asks for a 21st century institution. Now, the Guggenheim is back on track, and people are having meetings there. And we just want all of you to sort of revisit this archive. It's a really it's not a great website, but it has a lot of material, years and years of press, but also a lot of original research conducted by a lot of people here. That sort of says, what we did and what this sort of intellectual history of engagement with art production in this region, which is the same claim that the Guggenheim is making, involved. So I'll end there, and thank you for listening.
Now we'll move to Fouad Makki, who also joins us remotely, I think from Ithaca.
Okay. Thank you, Surafel. I also want to thank Salah Hassan for inviting me. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person, just the scheduling didn't work out for me. I also want to thank many of the people at the Sharjah Institute and the Africa Institute for all the kind of logistical help and communications that allowed this conference to take place. I've been asked to speak on new forms of extraction and surveillance, a rather huge topic. And I want to make a couple of preliminary remarks that might help to frame what it is that I'll be focusing on, right? Which will be, my remarks will be very, very brief and hopefully suggestive for a conversation that we'll have. So my first remark is that it concerns this relationship between the old and the new forms of extraction and surveillance. I mean, I don't see this as necessarily one of the supersession of the old by the new in some kind of universal or linear sense. The old and the new often coexist in time, however unevenly they might be distributed across space. And in some instances, they might even reinforce each other to generate distinctly hybrid forms of extraction and surveillance. And I think I want to emphasize this point, that although there are new forms emergent, they do not necessarily mean the end of the older forms. In fact, sometimes they reinforce the older forms. The second point is more sort of organizational about how I will present my rather very compressed presentation, right? Which begins with more general reflections on relations of extraction and then progressively moves to more specific forms, you know, from the extraction of labor power to the emergence of the body itself as a site of accumulation, from old to new forms of enclosures, from biodiversity to what has come to be called epistemic extractivism, and lastly, to what has come to also be known as surveillance capitalism. Again, the snapshots, no more than that. Now, relations of extraction have been constitutive of capitalism ever since its emergence in the age of European colonial expansion overseas, you know, the long 16th century, as well historians tend to call it. This was subsequently entrenched by the establishment of an international colonial division of labor, in which the newly colonized territories were turned into sources of primary commodity production. And up to today, right, you find in large parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, this kind of colonial division of labor persists, right? Many of these societies up to today remain primarily specialized in the export of primary commodity production. Now, the mechanisms of reproduction of this new social order depended upon the subjugation of both humans and non-human nature, converting labor into a source of value and a means of extraction, and nature into what Nancy Fraser succinctly calls a tap for energy and raw materials and a sink to absorb our waste. Now, the accelerating and accumulating impacts of this extractive global order has generated the global climate crisis of our times. And I think that is one of the impetus for this panel itself. Let me give you just one illustrative example of this. In Carbon Democracy, Timothy Mitchell has noted that within a matter of a few generations, and he suggests actually 1980, the industrialized world has burnt the fossil fuels that had accumulated in the earth over the previous 500 million years, right? So it's precisely this kind of accelerating and accumulating ecological crisis, right, that has made this question of extractivism and its accompanying forms of surveillance a central concern for us all. Now, opposition to these destructive tendencies have similarly gained renewed salience today, acquiring heightened political agency a cogency in places like Latin America, where the concept of extractivismo was coined during the peak of the pink tide. This is where you have more reformist, left of center political parties winning elections across much of Latin America, and especially after the 2008 financial crisis. Now, as the term ismo, the suffix of extractivismo suggests, this concept refers to the more systematic dimensions of relations of extraction, referring both to a model of development and to the broader effects of resource extraction. In a very thoughtful account of the political dynamics this has generated, Tia Rio-Francos, who's an author of a rather influential book, Resource Radicals from Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, has documented the bitter political contention that has emerged between two components of the traditional anti-neoliberal opposition. On the one hand, currents seeking to advance the redistributive priorities of the citizens' revolution, right? This is what the pink tide in part was about. And on the other, coalitions of predominantly indigenous movements calling for a shift away from an economic model that was overly dependent on the extraction of natural resources. While the first, this one based on the idea of a broadened social conception of citizenship, claims in the name of the demos and on the scale of the nation state, right? That's what it framed this set of demands. The second insisted on localized claims to sovereignty that took precedence over those of the nation state. For Rio-Francos, in principle, both positions have their moments of truth. A redistributive socioeconomic agenda is needed to address huge inequalities and injustices, while opposition to extraction must form part of any strategy to avert or slow down a surging global ecological disaster. But in practice, there has emerged an incompatibility between these positions. And this is not simply in places like Ecuador or other parts of Latin America. These have become, in many ways, a central political strategic issue in the global arena. And they pose various kinds of questions. Who is, after all, the imagined collective subject in these conditions, right? That might propel a shift to a kind of post-extractive world. And through what kinds of political struggles is that collective subject going to be forged, right? So this contestation over extractivism have invariably included, of course, the status of human labor power itself. And this is the second element I want to discuss, which ever since the forcible subjugation of Amerindian and African labor in the mines and plantations of the Americas has been the source of value creation in capitalism. And with the extension of the world market, the global labor markets have simultaneously or commensurately expanded, including various forms of both wage labor, but also coerced informal forms of labor. And more recently, the integration of the Chinese and Indian laboring classes into the global labor market, ever since the kind of reintegration of China into the world market, and the kind of neoliberal shift in a place like India, which also opened up Indian labor to international capital. About 1 billion workers have joined this global labor market. I will not dwell much on this rather self-evident point about the extraction of labor power from workers. I mean, suffice it to say that for any commodity to be exchanged, it first must be produced. Someone must have done something somewhere for it to enter the process of exchange, even if this takes on the appearance of an exchange of things, right? The market, this kind of reification of the market, reification of the commodity, and so on, that Marx so brilliantly illustrated in his discussion of the fetishism of the commodity. In other words, commodity relations are, after all, social relations, right? Even though they take on the appearance of this exchange of goods in quantitative dimensions or magnitudes rather than in the qualitative relations between people. But what is arguably new today is the conversion of the human body itself into a new site of accumulation, facilitated by biotechnologies, turning cells into what authors are calling microfactories, right? And making biological and human integrity itself vulnerable to the demands of the market. Studies related to the human genome have shown that the emerging markets for genetic information constitute new areas for the accumulation of capital and for the construction of new meanings and contexts for nature, both human and non-human. There's no gainsaying the importance of this topic, and it will become yet a more crucial and central area of social, political, ethical contestation in our times. Maybe during the discussion, we'll have an opportunity to discuss it more. Now, the commodification of labor power entailed an enormous, often violent process of social dispossession. The social world we would take today for granted, a world in which most people survive by selling their labor power, in which they are dependent on markets for their existence, all this is not historically normal. It involved a process of dispossession and enclosures, which is the third area that I want to emphasize, in which peasants were uprooted from the soil and non-European societies were attacked and compelled to open themselves to colonial and capitalist forms of transformations. The separation of the peasants from their land simultaneously separated the land from the producers and made possible their mutual reproduction in the form of commodities. This classic process of primitive accumulation, of enclosures, has been a recurrent feature of historical capitalism. Many of you are familiar with the argument David Harvey makes about this recurrent dynamics of accumulation by dispossession. Now, following the meltdown of the banking and securities markets on Wall Street in September 2008, however, a new form of enclosures has emerged. That's a new form of extractive relations has emerged. Driven by footloose speculative capital in search of new zones of valorization, right, after the financial crisis of 2008, the new enclosures were not necessarily interested in converting the enclosed lands or dispossessed labor into productive units. In many instances, the land was acquired for purely speculative purposes and was packaged for purposes of the futures market. This was often accompanied by a resurrection of colonial narratives of terra nullius, as the lands targeted for enclosures were designated empty or underutilized spaces awaiting redemptive forms of development. Most of the areas that were targeted for this new kind of enclosures were precisely those food insecure societies, right? Where the new enclosures represent a major assault on the most underprivileged communities of the global South, right? Where their lives in some ways are being foreclosed by this kind of new speculative form of enclosures. Now, if the new enclosures typically ignore the ways in which these so-called underutilized or empty spaces are socially constructed, the surrounding natural habitat is likewise reductively conceived as an inert backstage for the unfolding of human history. The same procedures that seek to instrumentally rationalize land use abstracted from its constitutive ecosystem, turning nature into a kind of fetishized and commodifiable resource. And the shift from smallholder-based polyculture to a capital and chemical intensive monoculture, wherever that has occurred, has accelerated biodiversity loss. And this is the fourth point that I want to emphasize about biodiversity, while shifting the burden of environmental costs onto the local communities. Now, this concept of biodiversity, which emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and was integrated into discourses on the global environment through such fora as the 1992 Rio Summit, identified the Global South as the primary reservoir of biological diversity. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who's really had very creative, who's done very creative work in exploring this notion of biodiversity and epistemic extraction, has argued that this has been accompanied by new, potentially more pernicious forms of extraction as multinational pharmaceutical corporations and the biotechnology industry seek to turn the indigenous peoples themselves into resources, no longer labor resources, but genetic resources and tools for accessing through traditional knowledges, plants and other living beings in the form of biodiversity. I mean, it could be a bit ironic about this kind of increasing celebration of indigenous forms of knowledge today is in part also in the service of these kinds of pharmaceutical companies who need these kinds of knowledge in order to access these huge reservoirs of biodiversity. Now for Santos, this points to yet another form of extraction, what he calls epistemic extraction. The claim, he says, for the universality of modern science is no more than a form of particularism itself, whose specificity consists in having the power to define all rival forms of knowledge as particular, right? This is the claim of science as objective, as empirical, as universal, and so on, right? And therefore, by definition, designates all other forms of knowledge as subordinate, as particular, and so on. So to conclude, because of the time, I know I might be running, I'm not sure where I am with time, but I'll try to be very brief about this concluding part. The last part I wanted to sort of throw out for reflection is the idea of cyber-capitalism, okay? Now, some of you will recall how the expansion of the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s found a cadre of cyber-utopian theorists who extolled the emancipatory potential of the internet. This is a moment of euphoria about the emancipatory potential, the liberatory potential of the internet in many ways. Digital technology, they argued, would foster communication and collaboration. Its decentralized networks would evade hierarchical authorities, unlock creative energies, and spread radical ideas, rendering a vast field of information accessible and transparent. The more people became connected, the argument went, the more freedom and democracy would flourish. Yet, some 20 years on, the internet, the web, has failed to deliver on these fantasies, and critics have increasingly railed against the growing power of the tech giants and their deleterious effects on democracy. This is perhaps best exemplified by the work of Shoshana Zuboff, who in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, has described a new kind of capitalism, bent on turning us into what she calls a behavioral psychologist lab rats, right? It's a very kind of interesting way in which she conceives of this. Behavioral data, she argues, has become a surveillance asset and the raw material to produce what she calls behavioral derivatives, prediction products, and behavioral futures, right? All these categories are a kind of the financial capitalism of our times. The very things that are actually sold by a corporation like Google, she argues, to advertisers, right? That are in order to bring in what are considered, what she defines as surveillance revenue, right? These are all the categories that become commodifiable in a sense for generating surveillance revenue. Now this for Zuboff constitutes a process of primitive accumulation, this is how she puts it, or digital dispossession. Like others before her, she adds an item to Polanyi's list of fictitious commodities, right? Remember the classic trio for him of fictitious commodities were land, labor, and money, fictitious because they were not produced, right? These were not, and therefore could not be really considered commodities. What she adds to this is idea of behavioral data too now has become one of these kind of crucial dimensions of capitalism, just as much as land, labor, and Polanyi's Trinity formula. Well, anyways, land and labor, the crucial ones. Now, the political climate after 9/11 has led to a surveillance, what she calls a surveillance exceptionalism, facilitating Google's metamorphosis as it is discovered, as Google itself discovered its elective affinities with intelligence agencies like the CIA. For their part, US security apparatuses, and this I think is a very interesting insight that she has, were happy to avoid constitutional checks by handing off the task of data collection to a weakly regulated private sector, right? So there's a very interesting kind of shift taking place. And before long, she argues, Facebook had also joined the game, using its like button to track users around the web and selling derivatives of the resulting data, right? So this is a new kind of surveillance capitalism that in some ways builds on and in some interesting ways also departs from the kind of discussion that Foucault popularized around the idea of the panopticon, right? As a kind of exemplary model of the new forms of surveillance and operation of power in the modern world, right? So I'll end there. I hope I haven't gone so much over my time. I'll be very happy to discuss this very, very compressed reflections during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fouad. Right on time. Our last speaker will be Nidhi, our friend Nidhi.
Sorry, I'm just going to get my bearings. I'll try to. I know it's been a long day, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. And I've put in a lot of little ethnographic vignettes, so hopefully those will keep you rooted in place. So today I'd like to think about how the Tao is a unique vector to think about surveillance, sovereignty, and extraction. These wooden sailing vessels that made the Indian Ocean the cradle of globalization offer what Eng Sang Ho has called a view from the boat, a counterpoint to imperial and colonial histories, providing other perspectives of mobility and the possibilities that they might generate. So today I'd like to take a view from the Tao in different historical moments, but in an ethnographic vein, to think about how histories of capitalist extraction and practices of sovereignty are braided together in the Indian Ocean context. So let me begin with recent events that became an entry point for me to think about these questions. The Indian Ocean has become a flashpoint for international security. Ever since al-Qaeda's attacks on American embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 1998 and the so-called global war on terror since 9/11, the Indian Ocean has become a site of greater surveillance by state and international authorities. For instance, the multiple-day siege of Bombay by armed gunmen on November 26, 2008, implicated mobility in the Indian Ocean in large-scale violence, as reports indicated that the maritime movement of weapons and people were crucial in planning those attacks. Indian Ocean trade has also been implicated in long protracted conflicts in Somalia and Yemen. In this context, the Tao has become an object of suspicion. Here, I'm referring to the mechanized dhows or vans from Kutch that continue to traverse old Indian Ocean routes, as Camp's work so beautifully traces and deals with multiple registers as well as multiple publics, actually. So these vans are largely manned by crews of Muslim Badala and Waghair castes associated with seafaring and historically also with piracy. Today, they go where container ships cannot or will not go, transporting foodstuffs, charcoal, dried fish, livestock, and even cars across Indian Ocean ports. Functioning as an economy of arbitrage, they have found a niche in servicing minor ports in times of conflict.
Governments and media have assumed that arms and militants can move easily on dhows across the Indian Ocean. The New York Times, unsurprisingly, putting this down to the Muslim populations that live and move along the Indian Ocean, especially in the context of Kenya, as demonstrated by this quote, which I'm not going to read, but it's up there, in the context of India as well, in the context of Kenya and India, sorry. Yet another case of the othering of Muslims after 9/11, the discourse had real effects on the ground and at sea. In East Africa and in India, dhow ports have been heavily surveilled. In Kenya by the US-funded anti-terrorism police unit, and in India by the Central Investigations Department and the police. These fears around security are very palpable in everyday life. Government informers and plainclothes policemen lurking in dhow ports. Hindu right-wing intelligence agents working with the Criminal Investigations Department in Mandvi in Gujarat told me in 2017, anything can come on these boats, weapons, people, drugs, you name it. In India, many of these suspicions were obviously Islamophobic, but also very vague, as Van crews are largely Muslim. But it is also clear that the dhow and the type of mobility it engenders is subject to greater surveillance after the rise of right-wing Hindu nationalism in India and in the wake of the so-called global war on terror. So current suspicions of dhows across the Indian Ocean, I suggest, have emerged from a deep-rooted anxiety over the long history of trade and connection across the Indian Ocean. Surveillance of dhows reveals tensions between long-standing mobile trade networks and state authorities, imperial, colonial, and post-colonial. At the heart of these tensions lie questions about territoriality and sovereignty. In the pre-colonial period, dhow networks functioned as what Achille Mbembe has called an itinerant territoriality, across political entities that operated on a shared, overlapping, and layered sovereignty, long a feature of Indian Ocean societies. But since the colonial period, mobile dhows and their dynamic trade networks have been forced to contend with the boundaries of the sovereign state, defined and delimited by British colonial and then national and international law and policy. These shifts in understandings of territory and sovereignty have led to the creation of regulations that seek to monitor and control these mobile networks and have pushed the dhow into the underbelly of the global economy. This is a shadow economy that is illicit in some moments and at other times complicit with state authorities and capitalist extraction. These dhows then cannot be seen as separate from or anachronistic in the world of global shipping and by extension capital today. Rather, they are crucial intermediaries, acting as feeders for steamship lines and now container ships, extracting value from the fragments seemingly left behind in the wake of corporate and state extraction. Global capital, then, is not only dynamic, heterogeneous, flexible, but ultimately braided with practices and histories of sovereignty. Dhows, I argue, are Indian Ocean hinges of global shipping, operating in spaces of conflict. Noor, a dhow owner in Mandvi, India, put it succinctly, telling me in 2017, wherever there is conflict, wherever there are restrictions, sanctions, that's where we go. This has always been the case. War never ends. Whenever we think one route has closed, another opens up. Ali, a dhow captain who was employed by Noor, added, "We were in Iraq during the Gulf Wars, and we have been in Somalia." Dhow owners and sailors understood that this was their niche. They were what Laleh Khalili has called sinews of war and trade. But what then does one make of regimes of surveillance and the movement of dhows that navigate amidst these multiple regulatory regimes? So in what follows, I'll trace different moments in which surveillance regimes and the mobility of dhows that navigate between them have led to competing and yet co-constituted forms of sovereignty. The first of these moments is the 2011 military invasion of Somalia by the Kenya Defense Force, the KDF, and the African Union Mission in Somalia, or AMISOM. These forces sought to suppress Al-Shabaab, a militant insurgent group with links to Al-Qaeda. One of the prime targets in this Operation Linda Nchi, as it was called in Kenya, literally Operation Protect the Nation, was the port city of Kismayu, long considered to be an Al-Shabaab stronghold and the main source of revenue for the group through the trade in charcoal and sugar. Much of this trade, especially in charcoal exported from Somalia, took place through Kutchi vans. These vans became subject to surveillance and control as the UN, Kenya, and AMISOM sought to cut off Al-Shabaab's revenues. Indian sailors and dhow owners were accused of complicity with Al-Shabaab. In 2014, Amir, a dhow owner from Bombay, told me, Representatives from the UN and the CID were here a few months ago. They told us that DAOs from Kutch were dealing in charcoal and that this was funding terrorists. Was he calling us terrorists too? How are we supposed to know that charcoal in Somalia funds terrorists? Yet he expressed helplessness over this development, and Amir is very good at sort of performing helplessness because he ultimately, this year actually ends up working with the Indian government. So you're also seeing a kind of slip between this moment of helplessness but also complicity. But in that moment, he says, what else are we supposed to do? We used to carry dates, but now those go in containers. There's no cargo for us to carry anymore. Amir's dilemma was born out of economic liberalization in 1991 in India that had ended a protectionist reservation policy for DAOs, which had once had the exclusive right to import dates into the country. This, in addition to the concurrent collapse of the central state in Somalia in 1991, the same year, made the DAO trade precarious and pushed it into the shadow economy in Somalia, where they came to transport charcoal. In the wake of Operation Linda and Chi in 2011, international agencies and states sought to restrict the movement of DAOs to the Horn of Africa. But DAOs continued to service ports in Somalia in contravention of the so-called ban and were further pushed into this precarious shadow economy as a result of state policy. DAOs charted their own itineraries in response to state regulation, even as their actions led to the creation of new regulations and an expansion of state surveillance and sovereignty. As Amir explained, after the UN ban on charcoal exports from Somalia and rising incidents of piracy, the government of India had drawn an invisible line prohibiting vessels from traveling to ports in Northeast Africa, from where 90% of DAOs made their profits. So less than a year before this conversation, I had been researching the illicit slave trade in 19th century Zanzibar. And as I was talking to Amir, the parallels between efforts to suppress the slave trade in the 19th century and current prohibitions on the DAO trade and the discourse around it actually became very clear. Not only were lines being drawn in the same geographical region, but a familiar logic seemed to be in operation. British efforts to suppress the slave trade in the 19th century led to an expansion of British jurisdiction and sovereignty in the Indian Ocean and a lasting association of DAOs with illegality. This is a result not only of what Johann Matthew has called the framing out of DAO traffics from capitalist markets, but of how market making is bound up with contestations over sovereignty. As Ritu Birla has argued, political economy in colonial India became a practice of colonial sovereignty through rules of law. The post-colonial state has continued to function with this logic of sovereignty forged through market governance. This is evident in how DAOs once associated with slave trading are now associating with smuggling and also in some moments terrorism. So in the 19th century, the tying together of slave trading and piracy became tools of British imperial expansion. Both piracy and the slave trade were seen as crimes against humanity and hence reprehensible in places of British influence. And you can see how the figure of the so-called terrorist is also kind of seen through this vantage of a crime against humanity. And this led to increased British presence in the Western Indian Ocean through surveillance and patrols at sea. Yet until the abolition of slavery in Zanzibar, DAOs continued to evade British patrollers. For British patrollers, such as this man, George Sullivan, who left a really long record of his experience in the Indian Ocean, for people like him, who were familiar with slavery in the Atlantic context, the slave trade in the Indian Ocean was completely illegible. The British could simply not tell if a DAO was a slaver or not. Patrollers acted like bounty hunters, often indiscriminately destroying DAOs at sea. Even after the end of the slave trade, DAOs continued to be associated with illegality, even though the colonial state itself often relied on them to transport supplies, especially during World War II. Yet British sovereignty was contested on the ground and at sea. For instance, 19th century DAO owners from the port city of Sur in Oman sought to prevent British intervention at sea by flying the French flag, over which the British had no jurisdiction. This led to the now famous Muscat DAOs case, which was taken to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague in 1905. While the case resulted in the making of international maritime law around the flagging of vessels and definitions of subjecthood and even citizenship, by using the French flag to bypass British surveillance, Suri Dhow captains articulated a vision of sovereignty in which protection was sought from multiple political authorities across the Indian Ocean. They were shopping for flags, essentially. Efforts to suppress the slave trade and Dhow sailors' maneuvering of these laws are a historical precedent for the interplay between these different visions of sovereignty and the production of shadow economies. Like in the 19th century, where a shadow economy in the slave trade was created through British regulation, by 2012, Dhows were pushed into the charcoal trade in response to legal interventions, continuing to skirt the ban using different tactics. This is a repetition of both colonial forms of intervention as well as the tactics used to maneuver them. But Dhow sailors also insist upon reiterating other imaginaries of sovereignty, political legitimacy, and life today. Since the Muscat Dhows arbitration case, ships have carried flags that mark the sovereignty of empires and now nation states. All ships have flags, the flag of the country they are registered in and the country whose waters they are in at the time. Dhows from India are, of course, also flagged this way. But they also have another kind of flag, a flag that is placed prior to the flag of any nation state. And you can kind of see it here. This is the flag I'm talking about. This is the flag of a patron Sufi saint. This flag goes not only where other flags go, visible to patrollers on top of the cabin, but instead is placed on the bow as if to say, lead the way. While the nation-state flag of a ship keeps changing, the flag of the Sufi saint is unwavering and marks a different genealogy of sovereignty, especially visible in times of danger at sea. Take, for example, the case of Irfan, a Dhow captain. On May 25, 2018, Irfan and his crew were anchored off the coast of Salalah in Oman. They were closely following the movement of Cyclone Mekunu, the most intense tropical storm to ever hit the Arabian Peninsula. The cyclone had caused unprecedented destruction in the Yemeni port of Socotra and was now heading their way. After securing the vessel, Irfan took out a small green flag and tied it to a banister near the cabin. The green fabric of the flag was cut from a sheet that had once covered the tomb, the body of Shah Murad Bukhari, patron saint of seafarers from Western India. The flag marked his presence and protection. When the cyclone hit Salalah, 7 other dhows capsized in the storm. Yet Irfan and his crew survived and continued their voyage to Yemen. For Irfan, sorry, this was not supposed to actually be. That was a video actually sent by the figure I'm calling Irfan. So for Irfan and his crew, the green flag was not only an apotropaic object, but also marked a particular kind of sovereignty. For him, the flag of a nation-state was simply a bureaucratic necessity, sovereign power actually lying elsewhere. This sovereignty, unlike the modern Westphalian sovereignty of nation-states, is grounded in notions of divine sovereignty, where God is the ultimate sovereign, the one who can make live or let die in Foucauldian terms. And the images that you're seeing here are from an exhibition I developed for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial in 2019. I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, but I just thought I'll show some images. And this conception of sovereignty that Irfan was sort of gesturing to with his use of the flag is predicated on a notion of life that draws from the philosopher Ibn Arabi's conception of wahadat al-wujud, or the unity of existence. In this vision of life, the force of non-living things, like corpses, shrines, and flags, are channeled into the living and vice versa. Life here is open, permanent, and perpetually unfolding, past, present, and future, the living and non-living imploding onto each other. As historian Wilson Jacob Charco has argued, although notions of divine sovereignty began to fall out in the 19th century, as modern forms of absolute indivisible sovereignty came into being, the splintering of political authority from the divine was never actually complete. Sufi figures like Shah Murad Bukhari continue to be pivotal in the making of modern sovereignty, and at the same time articulated a different strand of it. After all, Sufis played key roles in the making of political authority across the Indian Ocean. Sufis had authorities that sometimes overlapped and at other times opposed that of kings and empires. Shah Murad Bukhari is one such Sufi who wielded immense power over sovereigns in the worldly realm. He is known to have negotiated tax rates on behalf of the local populations in Kutch, and yet collected revenues from the ports for the Mughals and later even the British. Even today in the Dhow port of Mundra, near Bukhari Shrine, the only shipping agent continues to be his his descendant. The ongoing importance of figures like Shah Murad Bukhari and his descendants indicate that these nodes of authority are key anchors that continue to enable trade and mobility today. Anthropologists have long argued against closed notions of sovereignty, sovereign power being constantly negotiated and contested. However, not only is sovereignty open, but can there also exist other imaginaries of sovereignty, one in which divine sovereignty cannot be splintered from political authority? This conception of sovereignty does not change or shift the dynamics by which people like Irfan and other Dhow sailors now find themselves in these, in this shadow economy and in this sort of precarious position as intermediaries in global shipping and subjects that are now surveilled. But can it perhaps, and this is a question, this is an ongoing question for me, but can't perhaps we think of other genealogies and practices of sovereignty and how anchoring them in these sort of small gestures and ritual practices actually gesture to somewhat of an opening? So we're still in the matrix, but is there a slight glimpse of an outside or not? And I know this is the question that I'm going to leave you with today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists for these amazing presentations, practices, artworks. We have only 25 minutes, and I want to become the first moderator who has disavowed his privilege to ask brilliant questions. So I would like to open the floor. So I will send my questions to my friends later on. Use it. If not, I will use it. Okay, my friend there. Sorry, first I saw one hand from the back, and please don't grab the mic on your own. It's to avoid another set of surveillance, sorry.
Hi, thank you for those presentations. I certainly have learned a lot. Nidhi, my question is very straightforward. I was really struck by the generative paradox of surveillance that animates your talk compared to the rest of the people, maybe not so much with the camp folks, meaning that you're suggesting that the Dhows go precisely at the moment when surveillance escalates, but they're also subject to surveillance. So, I mean, it's a sort of a dumb Foucauldian question in some ways, but I feel like you're saying something a little bit more complicated. So could you say more about that economy of surveillance, which is both the source of income, but also the devaluation of their income? Thank you.
Okay, Naminata, please.
Okay, thank you. My question is for Lawrence. I found it very enriching that you combine both the audio and the visual. So what you have done here is to return us back to the etymology of the word surveillance, especially valence to is Latin etymology, vigilare, to mean to keep watch. So what you've done, what is supposedly invisible, you've materialized it in a visible form for us. So I appreciate that because I didn't think of that connection. But I just also could not stop thinking about surveillance. How do we go from the aerial aspect of it to the embodiedness, where portable recordings? So I think here there is a possibility of thinking about surveillance and surveillance when we talk about body level recordings. So what if you were to think about surveillance? What will happen to your practice or the map that you have? Thank you.
We can also accept other questions maybe? Oh, okay, please.
I have a question about divine sovereignty that you were mentioning, and also this other genealogies in relationship to ritual practices. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
If there are other questions for Shaina, Ashok, Fouad. Okay. Please.
Thank you. This is a question for Fouad. Can you hear me, Fouad?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So, you know, the way you outlined...
I didn't think there was a question directed at me, was there?
I'm sorry?
There wasn't a question directed at me.
Now there is one. So, in your presentation, the way you outlined the history of surveillance and extraction, especially extraction via a kind of history of primitive accumulation, seemed to have a very linear kind of evolution. And we know that that history is actually riddled with all kinds of contradictions and also, if I may say, discontinuities. So I'm curious where those discontinuities fall in the framework, because a lot of the discussion around surveillance extraction seems to be very linear and very easily evolutionary, as if this is by design developing almost as a natural condition. And a critique of primitive accumulation, at least later on, was that it kind of it posited the idea that the primitive accumulation actually happened based on expansion and expulsion. That it wasn't as if people had already the resources which constitute primitive accumulation, but in fact there was a process of deliberate expansion and expulsion which led to primitive accumulation. Long story short, yeah, where does discontinuity fit into the narrative of surveillance and extraction as opposed to a very easy linear kind of development of this? Because that just seems so predeterministic, you know?
Nidhi?
Can I say something, Simon? Question or comment for Nidhi? It's not an answer to the previous question.
Sorry? Oh, okay. Oh, please go ahead, Ashok.
Sorry, it is, yeah, okay. Just Nidhi, thanks a lot. As you know, we share a context of an interest in these. I mean, I even hesitate to call them DAOs, as you know, right? They are not the 19th century, 20th century DAO. They are something quite else, and that elseness is to be is I think also key. It's a kind of discontinuity in the history. It's a kind of weird cut where 3-engined wooden boats of 2,000 tons at some point were being made, right? So I guess the question is around the charcoal story. Like, as you know, in 2009 when we made the book, there was charcoal officially all over the record, right? And so in that sense, I would hesitate to call it a shadow economy. And I would very much hesitate to fall into the narrative that this was funding Al-Qaeda and so on, because those things are not, in my experience, completely true, right? I mean, I'm not sure what you mean in that sense by shadow economy. I mean, there are obviously things on the books and things not on the books, but charcoal was on the books for years and years and years. And it's only when specific state intervention disallowed it that, you know, now that it doesn't come, and of course it goes in other places, but that's always the case, right? I mean, so, but there was nothing shadow about it in that sense. when we were around these boards. And nor was the implication that this was funding anything called Al Qaeda at all clear, right? I know you didn't say that, but I just want, if you could expand on what you mean by the shadow in this case.
Okay, so I'll begin with, I guess, Ashok's question because it helps actually think about Anjali's question as well. Well, first to the question of are these even DAOs? I get asked this a lot, and I'm curious to have a conversation with you guys on this, because I think there's a way in which the mechanization, right, or the concept of the DAO itself referred actually, I'm using it as shorthand, it referred to many different kinds of vessels that kept changing, right? There was a continual shift in the way, in what a DAO is. The term wasn't even used by, by folks across the Indian Ocean littoral. It is a colonial term that came as a kind of shorthand for things that were called, the kotia in Kutch, for instance, or the bagala and the boom in the Arabian Gulf. So I use DAO as a way, as a shorthand that signals kind of this transformation. So the mechanized vahan, which is actually modeled on the kotia, is one instantiation of what we now call the DAO. And I think that's an important kind of, to me conceptually that's important, because what it's doing is it's not leaving the DAO as this kind of static entity, right? It's continually shifting and changing. And the sailors that I work with, or the badala and the wagers that I work with, insist upon this, right? That this is a form that keeps changing, that it can never remain static. The colonial term DAO doesn't capture that, but actually, if we reclaim what that term actually means and refer to it as something that does transform and is actually different in different contexts, does it allow a different kind of conceptualization of trade and mobility in the Indian Ocean more generally? And
yeah, but Nidhi, it's also country craft. That's what I find in British accounts more than the DAO. It's specific.
The country craft is used in British accounts for India. The DAO is used in British accounts from the Arabian Peninsula. And then in East Africa, for some reason, they use more specific terms. They'll use mtepe, for instance, which refers to a very small kind of vessel. So there's a way in which all of these terms are used differently across, bureaucratic registers, but also in kind of more sort of in personal accounts, they're used completely differently, right? By like European travelers, like Alan Villiers and so on. So I think that distinction is important, but also there's something to be said about using it as a collective term. The shadow economy bit of it. The charcoal case is actually very interesting because you're right, in 2009, that was not an issue. But when I started doing work in 2011, 2012, it became the issue, right? Something that was once legal suddenly became illegal in kind of thinking about the UN and the government of India, right? And they were concerned because Operation Linda Inchi was a very concerted effort to capture the port of Kismayu. Kismayu was at the time run by, and the port of Kismayu, the revenues from the port of Kismayu were being farmed by Al-Shabaab. So this was a very specific intervention that sought to kind of not only capture Kismayu, but also actually capture revenues from the port. The port ends up being in the hands of Kenyan forces, and they continued the charcoal trade actually, despite the UN ban on it. So the Kenyan forces were doing that, and they were continuing that. So I think the reason I use the term shadow economy, I don't mean it just as a kind of gloss for what is illicit and illegal. And in a longer kind of iteration of this work, I suggest that it's a kind of movement between and across in the blurry interstices of the legal and illegal, where you can't just, it's not one label, actually, that there's a movement, there's a kind of intimate relationality and a link, and something that was legal in one moment suddenly becomes illegal in the other and then shifts status, actually. So the charcoal case is interesting because the timing of it, right, it changes by 2011, 2012. And so the shadow economy part of it kind of deals with this interplay. And that leads me to Anjali's question around how the surveillance regimes actually also produce the kind of conditions for extraction, but there's a kind of interplay between how surveillance regimes are functioning and how these DAO traders are actually capturing profit within that, right? One way in which I've been thinking about this is to think of it as picking up on the fragments, right? So you have a colonial regime, a state regime that's kind of putting in place certain types of rules. But then there is also this insistence, and it's not just a resistance, actually. It's not, I don't see it as a resistance. But this insistence, in fact, that some kind of capture needs to be made in these like smaller boats of capital. And they're not anti-capitalist at all. In fact, they're the most kind of rational capitalist actors, that they are going to find another way to capture it, right? Which is also the logic of capital. So there's this kind of interplay between the surveillance regime, which is kind of seeking to capture trade in one realm, and then there are these reactions to it, which are coming from a kind of what some would call vernacular capital, although I'm very hesitant to use that term. So I think there's an interplay there, and we have to think about fragmentation and capitalism, not just with a capital C, but with a small c, and how this interplay actually comes about. Yeah.
Lawrence? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I'll answer the question that was posed to me. I'm not exactly sure
Sorry,
I've
Fouad.
fully understood it.
Sorry. Oh, okay. You may continue. Yeah. Why not?
And that is, I mean, if you recall, I prefaced my remarks by saying that I wasn't sure that one could easily separate the old and the new. That more often than not, what he found was these hybrid forms. This does not suggest any kind of evolutionary logic to that, right? It's quite the contrary. But there is, I think now we're at a point, that critical juncture in the kind of what you might call a confrontation between this vast power of giant high-tech companies and of governments, the kind of partially hidden economic logic of surveillance capitalism, the massive propaganda machinery, right, about the supremacy of the machine itself, right? All that, I think, is an emergent form in this current conjuncture. The digital form could not have existed obviously prior to the digital revolution itself, right? So that was not possible. To some extent, it was dependent on the digital revolution itself. But I'm never a believer that technology itself is what was determinant in this, right? It's within an existing wider set of power relationships that this new kind of technology now becomes serviceable. There's nothing evolutionary about that, right? That's a kind of conjunctural development having to do with the kind of electronic revolution that really took off in the early 90s. And it's embedded in its embeddedness within this wider relations of power. I also did, of course there was not much time, did mention the other ways in which surveillance had been discussed, principally by people like Foucault, right, in an earlier moment. In fact, for him it was coterminous with this kind of shift from sovereignty that was central to the emergence of new modes of power in the modern world. So yeah, that represents discontinuity from that form of surveillance. So on the one hand, what you see are new kinds of power relation, new modes of surveillance, right? Increasingly interested in behavioral modification, right? And ways of finding mechanisms of marketizing, financializing this kind of the mining of this data, right? And I think that's peculiarly new, right? And that represents a discontinuity from earlier forms of surveillance. But perhaps I haven't totally understood your question.
Thank you so much for your question. I think it's about, certainly in a presentation like this, you might not get a sense of where the body sits. But I think if you go to the work itself, I would hope that that's quite different. Or if you saw a performance last night, you would sort of see another type of activation of not really the body, but of modulating and shifting modes of attention. And I think, it's also there. What I've been really fascinated with in like following the trajectory of the field of forensic linguistics and forensic listening is that with each iteration, with each application, it recedes deeper into the background. More and more things that were once considered noise start speaking or singing or and so this kind of continual shift to the background is has been also something I've been trying to sort of reproduce or sort of call to attention in some of the works. And I think you see that, let's say, in the moment you look, it's very obvious in the moment you kind of look through that binoculars in Liverpool and you see the clock, right? You sort of recenter the urban space around the clock, right? Once everyone would have looked there, but then the clock becomes kind of personalized on the wrist and then personalized on the phone, and so increasingly the kind of functions of the state recede back to the background, and that kind of call to look at that clock is this sort of figure ground shift from what was once maybe the center of power to look at where the kind of state apparatus now sits. It's in the mains hum, it's in the buzz, it's in all these other kind of sites. So there's that level, and I think that does something to the body. I mean, when we do make those shifts, I think they're important. Likewise, in Gallery 4 and the work I presented here, I mean, I also don't have good images, that's why I show this one, because we literally just opened. That's why I show the one where they're pulling off the plastic. But likewise, there's a similar desire to take all these small moments and make an understanding, a shift, not of... there's a kind of figure ground shift again to the background, but more importantly, it's a sort of thickening of time. It's about taking all these tiny moments and making a kind of accumulation over the 15 years, because it's not in each plane that the violence is enacted. It's the 22,000 planes, right? It's the one long explosion that, the bomb that never dropped, the kind of long bomb that just kept on falling for 15 years. And I'm that's the attempt of those works. That's why I don't just make database or something like that, right? I mean, or also try to make database, but there's a lot of databases, and they sometimes it's exactly that move that you speak about that I think it's important to activate with the works and with the space of kind of performance or exhibition and other kinds of aesthetic practice.
Thank you. If I give the floor again to... Sorry?
Say something?
Oh, please,
Yeah.
please.
No, I just want to quickly respond overall to Fouad and Sabi and maybe Nidhi as well. There's surveillance, there's always been in various forms, and there's capitalism. And I'm not sure it's with the small c or the big C, and neither is surveillance with the small s or a big. They are what they are. And I think what makes how we parasite them, right? How we sit with the big or small c of capitalism and surveillance every day upon us, and what we as artists can do or make from it is really a matter of interest for us and a matter of practice, right? And to just draw the analogy, the reason why those boths for us contain possibility and agency is precisely for those same reasons. It's not just bottom-feeding capitalism, right? What are they doing? What are they parasiting on? And in what direction can things travel under exactly those regimes of surveillance? So for me, if someone says Facebook is surveillance capitalism and the FANGs, whatever they are, Amazon, Netflix, Google, I forget what S is, or FANGs, there's a double A as well. Yeah, but that's how capitalism will work and extract every last bit. But the possibilities are, how do you parasite them? How do you jujitsu them and turn them around, right? And in those small, fragile other worlds that are being built, for us lies the possibility of art. And I think that's where our affinity to those mechanized sailing vessels and the craft of building those mutants and taking them from Kutch to Jadaf and retrofitting them with Mitsubishi twin diesel engines and going into spaces of conflict. It's not just small c capitalism and the kind of, say, to jump into our own practice of making, really caring for and trying to build internet commons and parasiting from state archives and commercial Indian Bollywood cinema and so on is really where the possibilities can happen.
I think it's good to end with that note. What I'm thinking is, their engagement with archives, archiving, but it's not also archiving. They're bulging the archive out, new sequencing of images and new imaginaries. So I think we have been trying to think historically in the present, but through the works of Lawrence, Shaina, and Ashok, I have also witnessed what does it mean to think aesthetically in the present. I'd like to finish it here. Thank you very much for the wonderful, participation we have had so far. It was a wonderful session as well as March meeting. Of course, we are going to have to see an exhibition. So thank you so very much. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, Fouad. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our speakers and visitors. With that, we conclude the 14th edition of March Meeting, The Afterlives of the Post-Colonial. It has been a pleasure to have you join us in enriching discussions around the persistent legacies of colonialism, as well as emerging issues that have impacted recent global cultural, aesthetic, and artistic practices.